She had the frog. Hey everybody, welcome back to Life Under Deborah's Palm, where, if you like the channel, please like, subscribe, share, click the notification bell so you will be notified of any new videos that post. And also, as always, the website and the blog link are in the description box below. That being said, today what we're going to talk about is how God speaks through creation, how he uses those things to speak to us. And I'm going to give you some biblical examples, and I'm going to give you some real examples of things that have happened to me and actually to someone I know. First, we're going to read right out of Psalm 19, 1 through 4. The heavens declare the glory of God. The expanse shows his handiwork. Day after day they pour out speech, and night after night they display knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. Their voice has gone out through all the earth, their words to the end of the world. So what does that look like when creation speaks? That seems a little kind of odd, but if we go back to Genesis, right in the first chapter where God says, "Let there be light," he finishes and says, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs to mark seasons, days, and years." We mark time using the sky. We mark time using creation. The world runs pretty much on a Gregorian calendar, which is a solar-based calendar. It's 365 and a quarter days to go around the sun, and every 4 years we stick an extra day in there and even the whole thing out. Calendars and stuff have changed immensely over time, and some countries still run another calendar besides the Gregorian one, but the more global we've become, we kind of need a set time. And so that's our set time, the Gregorian calendar. And now if we look biblically, God's calendar ran on the cycles of the moon. They don't get a leap day, they get a leap month when things get off. So the sun and the moon, they mark the times and the seasons and the days and the years, just as the Lord said that they would in Genesis 1, it's 3 through 5 is what I read. That being said, let's take a look at probably the most famous story that, whether you're Christian or not, you've probably heard this somewhere or seen it in society, and that's the story of the Magi showing up when Jesus was born. They followed the star. The star rose, and they said, "We saw a star rise in the east. We know he's here somewhere." That story is found in Matthew 1 and 2, and it says, "After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, 'Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him.'" Okay, I'm just going to give you a rabbit trail number one, and that is this. People will, and just because you're going to hear this somewhere, say that Jesus was not a baby when the Magi showed up, and that is very likely. He was still very young, and if you read the story, in Matthew 1:10, it says they followed the star to the house where Jesus was. Remember, he was born in a manger somewhere and he was laid in the hay. So when you see those little nativity scenes when they bring him gifts and he's laying in the hay, no, that's not what happened. Herod faked him out, wanted to go worship the king. And obviously he wanted to kill the child, and he called in people and said, "Hey, what do we think this really happened?" And Herod's response is he kills all the boys 2 and under. So Jesus he could have been up to 2 years old. The Magi lived in what was known as Persia at the time, which was modern day Iran is usually what people think of, but the Persian Empire went a long ways and it went into Iraq, well, what we call Iraq today. That is likely where they came from. About a 400-mile trip, probably at least 3 or 4 weeks, maybe 3 weeks to make it, depending if they traveled on camels or how many came and their entourage. So they didn't show up the night Jesus was born or the day after Jesus was born, and that's all I'm going to say about that. The next question. So what was the star? Creation spoke. Now, no one knows for sure what the star was. It could have been some kind of planetary alignment. It could have been some type of, stellar phenomena. It actually could have been something angelic. It says they followed the star and it stopped over his house. I don't know how stars work that way. To me, it seems more angelic, but the scriptures say he followed a star and it was given as a sign, and they knew the sign when they saw it. So I'm going to give you rabbit trail number 2, because this often gets asked too, and that is, if the Magi lived in Persia, likely they were not Jewish, and the word Magi comes from, actually states that they were from the Orient. But the Orient probably is not what we think of as the Orient. We think of China or Japan or something. They say very likely that they came from Babylon. Listen carefully. Not known 100%. This is what people believe may have happened, is that they came from modern day Baghdad. Just south of Baghdad is where Babylon was. But how did they know? If they weren't Jews and they could care less what happened to the Messiah, how did they know? And I've heard a lot of theories, and I'm going to share the one that I think makes the most sense. And again, not known for sure, but because this question gets asked, don't forget the Jews were carried off to Babylon in an exile, and the prophet Daniel was added to the company of the king's sorcerers and magicians. They're magi. Only Daniel was not a magi. He didn't tap into the same spiritual realm they did. He tapped into what God had to say. But he very likely had influence on them and probably told them, hey, we're waiting for a Messiah, and here's what it's going to look like when he shows up and when he's born. And they have been keeping watch for all those years. That, rabbit trail number 2, and I'm ending it there. I don't know. I'm just giving you the theory. Last thing I'm going to talk about how God spoke. He spoke through creation in Exodus. All the plagues. The 10 plagues were there to judge the gods of Egypt, and God was making sure they knew exactly who was running the show. I'm not going to go through all 10 plagues. I will give you 2. The second plague was the plague of frogs, where the frogs came and overran Egypt, and then Moses kind of stopped that, but the frogs were all over and they were piling them and they were stinking up the place. Now, understand, the Egyptians worshipped multiple gods, and one of the gods they worshipped was a god named Hecate, or I should say goddess, named Hecate. Hecate was basically a frog woman. She had the head of a frog and the body of a woman. She was the goddess of birth. And no, God showed who ran the frogs by doing that. And that's what he did with all the plagues. The last one I'm going to talk about is the 9th plague, the plague of darkness. And the reason I picked this one actually is because most of us probably learned this somewhere in school when we learned about the Egyptians and the sun god Re. And in Exodus 10:21 through 23, it says, the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward the sky so that darkness spreads over Egypt, darkness that can be felt. So Moses stretched out his hand toward the sky, and total darkness covered all Egypt for 3 days. No one could see anyone else or move about for 3 days. Yet all the Israelites had light in the place where they lived. Again, the sun god Re was huge in that culture, and God was saying, no, wrong God, because the Jews had light. Egypt did not. So I'm going to give you a couple stories, and the first one is my story, and this was probably about 7 years ago, somewhere in there, and I honestly don't remember what I was praying about because it all resolved itself. But I was sitting in my backyard. It was dark. It was probably September, October, and it was a nice night. The stars were all out, and I was praying about something, and literally right as I finished praying, I saw a shooting star go over my house. Now, if you ever watch meteor showers, you know, a lot of them just kind of skip off the Earth's atmosphere and they're pretty quick. This one seemed like forever, although it was probably a couple seconds, and it went as a rainbow arc. It went as an arc right over the top of my house like that, and I kind of went, whoa. And everything was resolved shortly after that. Another story I'm going to tell is actually from a friend of ours, and years ago, before we knew him, he was involved in a church that was a fairly big church around here in its day, and he started to get this kind of feeling that something wasn't right, and he didn't know what to do. And we had a storm come through our area. It actually came across the whole state. It's called I think you pronounce it Derecho, and those things are straight line winds, and they came through thankfully in the middle of the night, or it would have been worse. But it came through and knocked down in our county approximately 10,000 trees, and it was pretty messy around here for a week or so. But in that, our friend said, you know, I went out to walk around. They lived in the city, and that's where a lot of the giant trees came down. And he said there was this big old tree laying over. It had broken half. And he said when he looked at it, you know, all the leaves were there and it was all green and stuff. But he said where it had broken, he looked and the middle of it was hollow. The center of this giant old tree was hollow. And he said he knew it. The Lord was like, that's what's going on where you're at. They look good, they're big, they're old, they're giant, and yet there's a hole in the middle. And he knew. And shortly after that, he left the church, and the church ended up going through some rough patches for sure. But he didn't know this. Now, I am a landscaper by training, and trees do rot in the middle. And that is actually called heart rot. And they can live for quite a while with heart rot before they finally tip over in a strong wind or come down. But when I told him that, he kind of went, you know, now that really, really makes sense. So that's just a couple things you know, sometimes you just know when God's doing that. So that's just a couple things for you to think about, how creation speaks. The other thing is an audible voice, and I'm not going to get into that. I kind of explained that with another video, and that is pretty self-explanatory. And that kind of ends this, and I believe the videos going forward will be about why God speaks and how to interpret your dreams and your visions, and what do you do with them, and how do you handle them when you get them. So until the next time, have a blessed day.